The topic I will be discussing on today's keynote is project planning in a world full of change. I thought when I was approached to do a keynote, this was a relevant topic, especially in today's world. We'll go over some of the topics that are relevant, especially today, with everyone working remote due to COVID. I thought that appropriate for this time. Our agenda for today, I will go through the announcement of the keynotes. I know Steve Brown did one a couple of weeks ago before Thanksgiving. We do have a couple coming up after me as well that I will go over. Quick introduction to today's topic. I do want to talk about my group within JCG, the project management organization. So we're going to go through that just to do an introduction for those who may not be familiar with our group. Then I'll go through the presentation on the topic, and then a quick contact us slide, and thank you for attending. All right, so as I said, for those of you who did attend Steve Brown's keynote, that was on November 20th. Mine is highlighted here on December the 3rd, Project Planning in a World Full of Change. We do have two more scheduled within this round of keynotes by Judge Consulting Group. The next one will be by Dan Lewis on December 10th. That is Globalizing Your Delivery Strategy in Regulated Industries. And then finally, John Howard, our Chief Project Officer, will do one on December 17th, which will be the Principles of Project Leadership. All right. For those who don't know me, my name is Michael Lee. I am the VP of PMO within JCG. Fact about ourselves for these keynotes. I think I had one about my family last time, so I tried to come up with something new. A new hobby I took up in 2020 was to become a runner. You know, you kind of set a goal for yourself at the beginning of the year. I wanted to become a runner. I've been able to keep up with that so far this year. And something I'm personally proud of is that I did complete a half marathon back in May of this year. So new hobby that I have that I've been trying to keep up with. All right, so like I said, for those who aren't familiar with the PMO organization within JCG, just want to spend a minute explaining what we do and discussing some of our core focuses. So our mission as the project management office within Judge Consulting Group is to manage the portfolio of projects and enable staff to enhance organizational responsiveness. I'm going to go over a couple of our focuses in a second, but our vision is to make project management an advantage within any organization. So not only within JCG, but as we engage with other organizations as well, we always want to make PMO an advantage within those organizations. Some of our services here listed on the right-hand side of the screen really boil down to three main focuses. As our mission states, we do manage the portfolio of projects in JCG. We enhance organizational responsiveness. We handle all status reporting, stakeholder communications, project planning, etc. We also engage clients for PMO advisory and setting up PMOs for clients. So a lot of the times we will engage or hear from potential clients that don't have a project management organization and are looking to establish one. So my organization gets involved in that to advise and help them set up a PMO. And thirdly, we have project process adherence and growth. So a lot of that is including resource forecasting, resource management, utilization management, tools maturity. We handle all of that for JCG. So as more projects come in, we need to do the planning from a resource level. We track utilization for all of our resources, and we try to enhance the tools that our team is using to handle all of our project work. Okay. The outline for the keynote today, as we said, our topic is project planning in a world full of change. So first we will go through and introduce the topic, and I'll be speaking on that today, why this is an important area to explore, especially in today's world, as I said at the top. From there, we're going to look at, quote unquote, the science of project planning. A lot of folks think about when they hear project planning, they're really thinking about the science part of it. And we're going to touch on that just briefly here today. After that, we're going to look at what project leadership is. We're going to just look at that briefly today and kind of explain the difference between project leadership and project management. However, John Howard has a more focus that explores the principles of project leadership that's coming up later on. After that, we're going to get into managing the plan. So a lot of people, they hear the planning phase, they think of the old school project plan. and say, okay, the planning phase is done. But as a PMO and a project manager, you never stop planning. The planning is always, it's ongoing. It's hour by hour, day by day. And we're going to explore three specific areas, which is scheduling and time management, risk management, and stakeholder communication that a good, strong PMO will have in place as they go through their continual planning in a world full of change that we have today. And that's the meat of our presentation here today. All right. Finally, we're going to look at executing change. Anyone who has ever been part of a project work in any capacity, which I'm sure is most of the people on the phone here today, knows that change to a plan is almost inevitable. But how that change is managed and interpreted and limits the project impact over time. So we're going to look at executing change as well. All right. So to introduce the topic, again, this session will explore one of the core components of any PMO, and that is project planning and managing the plan or orchestrating the plan. We will look at some of the many challenges that present themselves along the way and how to stay true to the need while handling the fast-paced change that is inevitable in today's world. So to kick this off, we are going to first talk about the good old-fashioned project plan. I know, boring, to most people, a lot of folks on the call, especially folks we work with, are technologists. The planning part of it isn't the most exciting for most people, but it is a necessary step. And it's necessary because you need to document the plan that is going to be executed. This is kind of like your playbook. And then from there, we're going to hear about the art of planning after that and what it takes to manage the plan. So like I said, documenting a plan is the first step. And that kind of looks like what I'm showing on the screen down there on the left. A lot of you have seen that before. But managing the project involves so much more in today's professional world. We're going to look at the planning aspect and what can be measured or formulated, but mostly we are going to focus on the leadership required to execute against that plan when consuming all of the challenges that will be presented. All right, so first, just the science of planning. So as I said, the first is kind of the boring part. It's documenting a plan and what goes into that, okay? This can be looked at more of a science, and it can be a combination of measurable units added together to formulate a plan. These components, some of the components that make up a plan are time, the team roster, who's going to be working on the plan, the team availability, the effort estimation, and the duration, okay? All of these, you're going to get an output. All of these factors is a measurable unit: time, number, percentage, hours, etc. And all of these are used as an input to that project plan. So now that we have documented a plan, we're not done. No good PMO is anywhere near done planning at this point. Every day against this documented plan and managing the plan begins at this point. So like I said, we're going to go through this part of it pretty quickly and then get into the leadership and the management of the plan in more detail in today's presentation. So just to touch on project leadership, when handling the project plan and team management, several skills need to be demonstrated. These skills can be attributed to any good project leader, and that is more than just a project manager. So what is a project leader and why is it of ever-growing importance? I took this quote from PMI. They recently did, a few years ago, a study on why project leadership is becoming more important. And the need for project leadership is growing as the world in which we deliver projects grows more complex. Something I took away from reading through that was this quote, that effective project management has become more challenging as the environment within which projects are delivered has become increasingly volatile and complex. Making it more difficult are changes to the characteristics of the project and the team, such as changing business relationship, new technologies, and more diverse stakeholders. So what do we talk about when you talk about a project leader versus a project manager? Project manager, if you can think of a sports reference here, more like a game manager. If you're thinking about a football team, usually a football strongest unit will have a leader, someone who's making plays, someone who is ahead of their opponents, someone who's thinking 2 steps ahead at all times, not just a game manager. And a project leader is kind of a representation of that. And it's someone who possesses and maintains a demonstrated ability and skill set in the following areas: And just to touch on a few of these, we are talking about overall people skills, building trust with your stakeholders, conflict resolution, conflict management skills, verbal communication and listening skills, strength in building teams, bringing a team together, understanding and balancing priorities, making decisions based on those priorities, the ability to think critically and problem solve on the fly. When someone possesses these skills and brings them to the project day in and day out, this is more of a project leader than a project manager. And it's very important in today's world to be able to manage the plan. Like I said, John Howard, our Chief Project Officer, has a session that's more focused on this, so he will go into more detail on this coming up in a few weeks. All right, so now let's look at managing the plan or orchestrating the plan. Like I said, after the plan is documented, in today's world, you're not done. You can't have a plan, document it, put it in front of everyone, and expect nothing to change over time. Especially with the quote we just looked at, if I go back to the previous slide, in today's world, we are dealing with more complex characteristics of the project team, changing business relationships, new technologies, diverse stakeholders, etc. Things are going to change. So now that we talked about documenting the plan and we teased the ongoing management of planning needed and how a real project leader can help with this greatly, one of the very first steps that can be taken to manage the plan is to set proper expectations on time management. And one of the biggest mistakes some PMs make is boxing themselves in right away to time delivery. Why do that? Unless your project is really date driven and something has to be done by a certain date, and all stakeholders are aware of that and they are willing to look at scope and other things that can be adjusted in order to hit that date, don't commit to a specific end date too early. Keep it to a month level, keep it to the week level. Talk about the end of the, half of January, we will deliver this phase of the project. In early February, we will be doing this phase of the project. Give yourself a little wiggle room, because what you're doing is you're immediately setting expectations. And if you set expectations to a specific date and don't anticipate change to happen, then you're boxing yourself in. Okay. I'm going to show a little graphic over here that project managers and folks within any PMO are pretty familiar with usually. And this is what PMI calls the cone of uncertainty. And really what this is the second line on the left-hand side there. The more you know about what you are delivering, the more precise you can be about when you deliver it. So if you look across the bottom of this graph, we have your typical planning, analysis, design, implementation, testing, deployment, typical phases of a software development lifecycle, or really any project lifecycle. And when you start talking about specific dates or setting expectations too early, your uncertainty is too great, and your setting expectations maybe cannot be met. So we look at this cone and how it gets smaller over time, because what it's representing is exactly what it says on the left. The more you know about what you are delivering, the more precise you can be about when you deliver it. So a lot of times we try to get through the analysis phase of a plan before we start setting expectations for specific dates on the design phase, the implementation phase, the testing phase, or the deployment phase. And that's what this graph over here represents. Okay. The point here is that until you are through analysis, you can't know with any level of certainty the complexity or the plan changes that are needed to deliver against a specific time. And even after analysis, uncertainty still exists. But as time progresses, certainty becomes more clear and more specific timing can be discussed because accuracy is growing more certain. So this right away is something a project manager or a project leader can do in order to set themselves up for success when planning a project in today's world full of change. The second item I want to go over when managing the plan or the ongoing planning that takes place in today's world, risk management. Again, everyone on the call, I'm sure, has been part of a project team day in and day out, or in some capacity is always part of a project. And there are risks that pop up. These risks can be categorized in a few different buckets we're going to look at in a minute. So risks will occur. What we want to do through management and planning is to avoid as many of those risks as possible coming to fruition. Once a risk is realized and does come to fruition, it is now a project issue that needs to be addressed. So we want to look at these risks and how we can avoid them turning into issues that are really going to disrupt your project planning. Okay. First is the known risks. A couple examples of these are imposed deadlines from stakeholders, vague goals in the project documentation. So an SOW or any project documentation you have to kick off a project, the goals of the project may be documented in a very vague state. So those are some examples of known risks going into the project. Usually the project team is aware of these risks. They know that the goals are vague. They know that they need to do some planning to avoid these risks coming to fruition. To define these are recognized by a number of people involved in the project and is evident early in the project planning activity. Secondly, are unknown risks. Project managers are used to expecting unknown risks and should be planning for unknown risks as early as possible. These couple examples could be team allocation changes. So if we have an engineer who's available 100% of the time at the beginning of the project, and we expect them to be available 100% of the time through deployment all the way through the life cycle, then something else comes up or individual gets sick, whatever it may be, that allocation changes, right? So we're not planning for that at the beginning, or we're not, this isn't a known risk at the beginning, but it is a potential risk down the road that is known by a very limited or specific group of people and may not be recognized during the project planning activities. Another example of this is poor quality. You've planned, you have your resources, you are delivering, but the stakeholders aren't happy with the quality, and so you may need to make a change. These are unknown risks and also need to be planned for as a project manager. The third one are unknowable risks. So these are things no one would know at the onset of a project or even think about during some of the initial phases of a project. Examples of this are third-party changes. And when I say that, I'm talking, if you're working with a partner who's doing some of the UI user interface work, and you're doing some of the back-end development work on your project team, and all of a sudden, before you're supposed to get the final wireframes for the UI, the third party reaches out a few days in advance and says, hey, we're going to be delayed by 3 weeks, right? You can't control that. That is a partner who is controlling that, but your work is dependent upon that. So that's a bit of an unknowable risk because you didn't know and didn't have control over that risk popping up. Another one that may be more relevant for today's world is COVID-19. So we've all been affected by COVID-19 in one way or another. I know everyone's probably sick of hearing about COVID-19 and how it affects their work, but as project managers, all of a sudden, all of our teams are remote. And all of a sudden, our communication tools may needed to be changed or adjusted. It was kind of the snap of the fingers, and all of a sudden, some change happened. We didn't know that was going to happen. And these types of risks are totally unexpected and virtually impossible to foresee. So what I want to focus on is how we manage those risks, but then I also want to focus on what a good project manager or project leader does to quote unquote plan for those risks. Even though they're unknown or unknowable, how are we planning for them or how are we preparing for them? So we're going to go over that as part of the risk management in the next few slides. Okay, so how do we manage all of these different types of risk categories? We do this through identification, analysis, mitigation planning, and mitigation execution, all of which make up the risk tracking cycle. So risk identification, risk analysis, risk mitigation, risk planning, and that we have the risk tracking and mitigation planning cycles, okay? When you're talking about risk identification, it's what could possibly go wrong. You're always thinking that as a project manager, what could go wrong? You're playing these scenarios out in your head. The analysis, how could this affect and impact my project? So think back to the slide before, a couple of those examples I gave, known risks, unknown risks. How is that going to impact the project? And then mitigation planning, how will we handle risk if it occurs? If this turns into an issue and this risk comes to fruition, what are we going to do? Right? It shouldn't be reactive, it should be proactive. You should be planning for these risks ahead of time because planning is ongoing. We documented the plan, but we're constantly continuing and changing the plan. Mitigation execution, so if a risk actually does happen, what actions are we taking if that risk occurs? So what are we doing? We've planned for it. What are we actually doing in the risk mitigation execution? And then tracking. We're improving the risk management process and tracking new risks. So we learn, maybe we talk about 1 or 2 risks and we handled it a certain way at the beginning of the project, but we should learn from that. And what can we do better the next time a risk pops up? Because you're maturing and you're getting better as the project goes on. And that is constant planning and managing the plan. Okay. So for unknown and unknowable risks, a lot of the times what you'll start to hear, or as a project manager, when it comes to these unknown or unknowable risks, we defined a few slides back, you're going to start to hear questions or comments like that are on the screen. Whether it be from peers or other members of the team or stakeholders, if you're prepared, you're going to start to hear questions or comments like this. How could you have known that was going to happen? When did you determine the project would be affected like that? You were able to react to that quickly, even though nobody saw it coming. You got lucky. The stakeholders were so understanding of your changes to the plan and didn't fight you on it. But to me and other project leaders who are truly planning every day for project success in an ever-changing and complex world, you have already prepared for these scenarios. One of my favorite lines is luck favors the prepared. And if you all can bear with me for another sports reference, something that I remember watching probably several times growing up and more recently is a Michael Jordan documentary, one of those Come Fly With Me or Michael Jordan to the Max, if any of those, if anyone on the line is familiar with those types of documentaries and have watched them. One of the things he said, and it really stuck with me over the years, is that on the topic of specific moments coming up in a game and getting comments from the media or reporters or fans saying things like this, how are you ready for that? You fared so well, you found success in that moment that nobody could have seen coming. Something he said is that he's always ready for those moments, whatever that moment may be. And it doesn't throw him off his game because he's played that moment over and over again in his head prior to stepping on the court so many times already. So he is mentally prepared. He has prepared himself. And when people say, oh, you got lucky, that ball bounced your way, or you got lucky, the rebound came your way. He has planned for these, and he's putting himself in a situation through preparation to be successful. And when you're talking about unknown risks or unknowable risks, this planning and this mental exercise that a project manager or project leader does over time is something that prepares them. So instead of saying, oh, you got lucky or your stakeholders are so, you've prepared for this. You've planned for this, and that planning is happening every single day. You may do it consciously, you may do it subconsciously. A lot of project managers and project leaders, even when they're not online, not at work, things pop in their head. They say, oh, if that happens, what are we going to do? And that is the ongoing planning that is required in today's world to deal with those known and unknowable risks. Okay. So to wrap that up, that is what project leaders and managers do to be prepared for unknown risks and still set their teams up for project success, even though these risks may come to fruition and may happen. All right. And then the third one is stakeholder communication. So we talked about what you can do to set expectations around time and delivery expectations. We talked about what risks may pop up during a plan or during a project that you need to constantly plan for in today's ever-changing world. And what goes along with this is stakeholder communication. So my previous keynote last year actually focused on this topic all the way through. And it's something that's just so important because no matter what you're doing, you can do all the planning in the world, all the documentation in the world, but if you can't communicate it and you can't get stakeholders to buy in and understand and be aligned, it's not going to do you much good. So the thing we're going to focus on is stakeholder communication. And once we are planning effectively and we are managing the plan daily, making changes, determining timing, delivery, managing risks, how we communicate that to our stakeholders is of utmost importance. All of this planning and managing is great, but if your project stakeholders aren't aware and aligned, that isn't going to do you much good. So let's just revisit quickly the stakeholder communication best practices. The items and actions on the left-hand side here are all things that should be considered when formulating a message to any project stakeholder regarding the plan or really anything that's going on with the project. So you want to consider your communication tool and your path, the message focus, and the message format. And when we talk about the communication tool or path, just to look at that one first, you want to ask yourself these types of questions. Does the tool fit the message? Does this require a formal or an informal communication? What is the easiest for them to consume? Status meeting, email, personal call, message board. Different people consume messaging different ways. They have their own preferences. You learn this over time. You want to tailor your communication and your communication path to what they are going to see, what they are going to understand, and what is going to ring true to them. Some simpler questions, are they even going to see your message? If someone gets 1,000 emails a day and you send an email, Are they going to see it? What are they going to see it, right? So you need to think about these things. Maybe it's a quick text message, say, hey, I need to talk to you for 5 minutes, and then setting up a 5-minute phone call. Is that going to get through to them? You want to always consider these items as you go through any stakeholder communication. Okay. And lastly, what promotes a partnership and growing the relationship? As a project manager, one of your main focuses is to grow the relationship, build trust, and manage your stakeholders on the client side, internally, everything. So what message format and what tool is going to grow that relationship? All these things should be considered through any communication, whether it's talking about risks, timing, again, anything on the project. The second thing is the message focus. What questions do you want to answer for your stakeholders in your message? And keep that end goal in mind when formulating that message, and make sure the focus is always there. Does your message align to what your stakeholders want to get out of the project? And if communicating change, has the impact been identified for stakeholders before they even have to ask? Communicating change and you say, hey, this is changing for the project, there's going to be questions. Well, what does that mean for time? What does that mean for budget? Is the team available for this change? What type of resources do we need? You should be answering those questions as a planner, as a project manager, as a project leader within your messages. That way the stakeholders know you're on top of it, they know you're managing it, you're building that trust, and you're setting yourself up for success and the project team up for success. And lastly is the format. Is your message clear and concise? Especially for executive stakeholders, less is often more. Don't lose them in words. Especially in today's world, people are used to snippets, right? Quick hitters. So if you're writing a very long email, and sometimes you do need to write a longer message to make sure something is documented, but are you following up with that with a more concise communication to get your point across and make sure they are consuming what you are messaging? All right, and I said this last time too. It's something John Howard, who mentor of mine for a long time and is back with JCG as our chief project officer. He taught me this several years ago, and something I think about every day when I'm messaging my team internally, stakeholders, sales partners, whoever it may be, right? You need to anticipate needs. And my note here is, especially with, but not limited to, executive sponsors, it is important to answer their questions before they ask. It's not a suggestion, as I said last time, in taking a predicting the future, but paying attention and using your gathered observations and lessons from past communications to anticipate questions and concerns that may come up or come back to you, and apply that to your messaging. If you can develop what's called this sixth sense of anticipating these needs and anticipating what's coming up for the project and communicating that, you're going to establish trust and very quickly build that trust between yourself, your role as a planner, as someone who's managing a plan, and the project stakeholders. Okay. The last topic before we get to our summary on managing project managing in today's ever-changing world is executing change. So the point here is change will happen, right? Especially in today's world. We talked about some of the known and unknown risks, some of the things that are coming up in these more complex situations, more diverse stakeholders that we are dealing with. Change is going to happen. It could be to scope, it could be to budget, to timing, or it could be to all of the above. We also need to plan and manage for the change execution process. If you submit a project plan at the beginning and think you're done, again, you are not planning for change to occur. And part of planning in today's ever-changing world is planning for change to occur. It's trying to get ahead of these changes and knowing what will happen if these changes do occur. Okay. So this process is not just about filling out a change form. A lot of people are familiar with change orders, change forms. It's not just about filling out a form and sending it to the stakeholder or client for approval and being done. This process is planning, engaging, implementing, evaluating all of the change for the project. So for each one of these, I'm just going to go through quickly what is entailed when planning for change, when engaging the change, when implementing the change, and when evaluating the change. So first, we'll start with change planning. A couple of questions there. Is there a clearly defined case for change? Before you even communicate a change or talk about a change or engage the client on a change, have you defined a case for the change? Have you talked to them about it? Are they aware that this change occurred? And are the objectives of change clearly defined, and have they been communicated? From there, some of the questions for the planning into the engagement. right? Are there plans in place to address change resistance? Just like change is inevitable, some sort of resistance or some sort of questioning may come back, and that may be inevitable as well. Are you planning for that resistance? Are you planning for a client or a stakeholder, an internal team member, whoever it may be, to resist the change? Have you put plans in place to address that resistance? Has a communication and engagement plan been produced? Are you prepared going into the communication? Have you communicated an engagement plan? You have to have the plan ready before you engage. And then how will you continuously monitor stakeholder engagement? You should also go over that when handling the change engagement. And there are several other questions. I have a fully baked out kind of change management checklist, but these are some examples that fall under each category. Thirdly is the change implementation. A couple of questions you want to ask yourself as a project plan heading. Have the processes required updating been identified with a clearly defined owner? So do we know what is changing? Do we know the processes that are changing? And do we know who's going to own those processes? Is that part of your change plan? If it's not, then you're not ready for the implementation stage of the change. And is there a rollout plan for change which has been approved? You never want to go in with a rollout plan, any sort of release plan, deployment plan, unless it's been approved. You want to talk to the end software, you want to talk to the people who are going to be affected by this change and make sure they approve the rollout plan and they understand what the plan is. So questioning around that rollout is limited. Again, all of this is part of the planning that needs to take place in today's world when we do deal with risks popping up and then executing change if those risks turn into issues and affect kind of that iron triangle of project management, time, scope, and budget. And then finally, continually mature and get better. So you always want to do a change evaluation as a planner. Key performance indicators are being monitored and updated on a regular basis, and mechanisms are in place to evaluate the satisfaction of the stakeholder groups impacted. This may be a little more internally as a project manager or project leader. You want to always evaluate the change and make sure are there any changes that need to happen to the actual process, to the change management process, and do we need to plan for that next time we need to engage this process? So all of this falls under that planning and managing the plan, orchestrating the plan. We talked about the very first slide, how the science of project planning is very important, but it's really only the starting point for ongoing plan management success. Project managers, project leaders, anyone who's responsible for planning in today's world needs to plan every single day and even every single hour at times for the subjects we talked about here today. Managing a plan in today's world of change requires several project leadership above project management core competencies. We did look at that. We looked at some of the people skills, the change management skills, the skills it takes to prioritize and be able to make critical thinking decisions based on the prioritization. That all falls under the heading of project leadership and how a project leader plans ongoing throughout a project. Third bullet here to summarize the topic for today is multiple challenges will present themselves and look to uproot your plan. Some you may have anticipated and others you may have not. You may not know we're coming. We talked about unknown risks. We talked about unknowable risks. We talked about being prepared, right? The two main things from this that I really want to stress at the end here is that change will happen. When you're planning in today's world, part of that planning is planning for change. We looked at that last in the slide here, but executing change effectively is a full cycle process of planning the change, engaging the team and stakeholders, implementing your change plan, and ongoing monitoring of change impact. It is not simply a change form and saying you're done. There's a lot more to the change planning and how that rolls into our overarching topic today of planning in today's world of change. And then lastly, being ready, right? Again, to say that one of my favorite quotes there, luck favors the prepared. To manage risks, known, unknown, and unknowable, managing time impact and building stakeholder trust will go a long way in successfully executing a plan. Doing that preparation actively throughout the days, weeks of a project plan will prepare you to be successful when an unknown or an unknowable risk does present itself. All right, so I do want to thank everyone for attending today. I think we went just about a half hour or so here. Again, my name is Michael Lee. I am the VP of our project management office within Judge Consulting Group. If anyone does want to reach out to me with any questions, my email is mlee@judge.com, and it's on the screen here today. I do sit in our corporate HQ office in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And again, want to thank everyone for attending. And then just a reminder as we close things out, our next keynote is Globalizing Your Delivery Strategy in Regulated Industries, something that Dan Lewis does every single day, and he will host that one. That will be Thursday, December 10th of this year. So thank you everyone for attending, and I appreciate your time.